So Vienna is known for having one of the most affordable and high quality social housing in the world. In fact, there's something called the Economist's Global Livability Index, and Vienna has topped it in recent years. Similar to Singapore, Vienna social housing isn't just for the poor. Around 80% of the population is eligible to apply. But unlike Singapore, Vienna's system is built on a rental model basis with long-term affordability in mind. To understand how this works and what Singapore can learn from it, we are joined today by Dr. Gerald Kössl. He's a sociologist and researcher at the Austrian Federation of Limited Profit Housing Association, and he's worked on housing policy in both Austria and the UK. So welcome, Dr. Gerald.
Hello.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just go straight into the questions. In terms of numbers, Vienna started its housing program in 1923, and by 1934, in about 10 years, built 65,000 flats across 350 housing estates. And today, there's about 400,000 flats, so about 40% of the total housing stock is part of the social housing sector. I would love to hear what historical and social condition push Vienna to build such a large social housing stock.
Yeah, so there's actually two sectors. You were talking about mainly the municipal housing stock, which has its origins in the 1920s, this period which was described as the period of the Red Vienna, where a lot of new municipal housing estates were built because of the conditions of housing that people faced in that time. But some, like the sector that where I'm working, is the housing association sector. So this is limited profit housing associations that actually predates the municipal housing sector. That's similar in the UK, where you have sort of philanthropic organizations setting up new housing schemes. And in Austria, this was very much an idea of cooperatives. So people actually start building together. They bought building material collectively. They built collectively. And it was really the idea of self-help and this cooperative movement that really sort of shaped and still shapes this sector, the limited profit housing sector. Later on, then there were subsidies involved that these organizations grew in size, especially post-Second World War. The limited profit housing sector grew significantly in size. And today, you've mentioned already, a quite high share of people in Vienna, but also in the whole of Austria. So limited profit housing is not just limited to Vienna. It's a national sort of piece of legislation that regulates the sector, and these organizations exist in the whole country. So in total, you have in Vienna about 20% of all households live in limited profit rented housing, and you also have about 20% or a bit more living in municipal housing. So that's where you arrive at the roughly 40% of all homes that are sort of where households live, which is housing not for speculative purposes, but actually for a cost rent or cost-based sort of rents.
Can you maybe, for the listeners, explain a bit more? Because I think from what you're saying is that there's actually almost three prongs like to the whole housing sector. There's the for-profit, as I think with many societies, but I think in Austria particularly, there's the municipal and the limited profit housing. And maybe can explain, I guess, how, like, what's the role of each of these housing sectors within the Austria housing market, and what's like the difference in terms of the housing that they all provide?
Yeah, so I mentioned already the municipal housing sector. This is something that mainly exists in Vienna because for those historical reasons that I've mentioned already, that there was in the 1920s, then also later on, even in the post-war period, there was still quite a lot of building activity in the municipal housing sector. Outside of Vienna, it's different. You don't have a lot of municipal housing. You have mainly the limited profit housing. So municipal housing is really public housing. So it's owned by the municipality, managed by an organization that belongs to the municipality. And then you have the for-profit sector who provide housing at rents maximum price that is basically possible to charge. And then you have the limited profit housing sector, which is like a third sector in the housing market. So you have organizations who are operating, or they're charging only the costs that are involved actually in building, financing, and managing these homes. So there's like a third sector in the housing market. It's private organizations, but they are they're not there to make a profit, but they are basically only charging tenants the costs that are involved in building and maintaining the buildings.
What led to the rise of the limited profit sector? Because I think this is something that's very unique. Because I think over in Singapore, I think we have something similar to the municipal housing, whereby it's just built by a housing agency.
It is a lot of it comes from this what I mentioned, the cooperative movement. Which is basically private individuals coming together, doing things together, building together, and then achieving economies of scales by building together, and then using that housing stock not for the for making a profit, but actually to the benefit of the people who live in this type of housing. And the other origins are actually the companies that started, like there was a big need, especially in urban areas, to build housing for workers. And companies actually started building housing for their workers. And that also sort of later on became integrated into this limited profit housing sector. Nowadays, it is not limited anymore to people working for a particular company. There might still be some ownership in these organizations from from other companies, but the main idea is that these organizations, they are now all sort of operating in a fairly similar manner, that they provide housing to the general population. There are some income limits, but they are relatively high to ensure also social mixing in the buildings, in the neighborhoods. And this sector is also the sector that's actually building a lot of new affordable housing. So the municipality in Vienna, I mentioned it's mainly a Viennese thing to the municipal housing stock, is still building, or is there's again building a little bit, but most of the new affordable housing construction, when it comes to rental housing, comes really from the limited profit housing sector. So it's a sector that has a large historical housing stock, but it's also building a lot of new housing. So roughly about a quarter of all the new production in Austria is actually built by limited profit housing. And if you look only at the rented sector, the share is even higher. It's about half of all new rented housing is actually built by limited profit housing associations. They build mainly multi-family homes, so not single-family houses, which are also very common in rural parts of Austria. But if you look at urban areas, multi-family housing, but even in other parts of Austria where you have less developed private rented housing stock, especially in smaller towns, limited profit housing also plays a quite significant role in those areas because of the lack of other sort of housing options, and especially more recently with the increase in house prices, also in rents, this type of housing has become a lot more attractive. And also because it's a good quality housing. It's not cheap. It's not housing built cheaply, but it's actually housing built at a very high quality, and it is attractive to a lot of different types of the population.
In certain cases where there's already a co-op, you then have a limited profit sector that comes from there, because the co-op are the ones that spearhead this. But then where do the municipal housing come in to complement, or I guess compete? Like is there a competition / complementary factor there?
Probably not much competition when it comes to new construction, because most of the new construction is actually happening in the limited profit housing sector, and obviously also in the speculative housing sector. And what's also quite significant still in Austria is single family houses, but this is a slightly different market, people building their own houses. So in Vienna, the situation is that the municipality provides public funding for this type of housing. So they provide loans over a long period of time. So we're talking about 40 years with a low interest rate. So these organizations, when they build something, that they have long refinancing periods, and that also means that the rent that they charge is a lot more affordable than if you had to refinance a building within 10, 15 years, which is typically the case in the for-profit sector. So you have a municipality in Vienna who provides some funding and who's interested in this type of housing to support this sector. But it's not in competition to the municipal housing stock. So I mentioned that the municipality in Vienna is building housing again. So there's some sort of new municipal housing also being built at the moment. But we are talking here about maybe 100, 200 homes in municipal housing every year in Vienna, compared to about 5,000, 6,000 in the limited profit housing sector. So that's a very different sort of relation. But in terms of the historical housing stock, the municipality manages a very old housing stock. In introduction, you mentioned dating back to the 1920s. So the average sort of age of the municipal housing stock is a lot older, has a different typology in some ways. And the limited profit housing sector, because of the building activity in the last decades, strong building activity, the housing stock is a bit newer on average, but there is also this older housing stock from what I've mentioned before, dating back to the sort of 19th century, like early 20th century. But most of the limited profit housing stock that exists nowadays in Vienna is probably built in the sort of post-war period and in the recent decades.
Can go a bit deeper into, I guess, the concept of the limited profit housing, because I think you mentioned a few things, like let's say the idea about it having a reinvestment fund, this revolving fund, and cost-based rental, and cap returns. How does it actually work in practicality?
So the limited profit housing associations build at cost recovery. So when they build something new, then they calculate the rents based on the costs that are involved in the construction, in the financing of a building, in the management of a building, maintenance, etc. So they have to factor in a lot of costs, and they have to recover these costs legally. So they are not allowed to charge below that cost for a particular building, but they're also not allowed to charge more than that. So that idea is really that you recover. You have organizations that can easily pay back with the loans that they have taken up, because it's typically loans from a bank, from the municipality. They invest their own equity, and they have to basically recover these costs over a long period. So that's the difference also to the for-profit sector. You have longer time spans, longer time periods, which does something to the affordability of housing. And in this cost calculation, you include a lot of factors. So as I mentioned already, the bank loans, the public loans. You also factor in from the very beginning maintenance or renovations that might happen in 10, 15, 20 years time, because you don't want to suddenly increase the rent, which is happening in many other cities or countries across Europe, where you talk about renovictions, where organizations renovate, then they increase the rent, and people actually cannot afford anymore to live there. So this is avoided by factoring in a lot of costs from the very beginning. It's also more equitable for tenants, because then tenants who move in after a renovation are not paying more than those who live there maybe in the newer housing stock. So it's trying to spread these management and maintenance costs over a long period of time. And all this is pretty much self-financed from the rental income. So that's why the construction costs, the land costs are such important factors in this system, because if you have high input costs, then you would also arrive at a high cost rent. So it is really important that these organizations have access to good land. They have construction costs which are within a range that allows them to provide affordable housing in relation to people's incomes. So that's really the idea of this cost rents, that you, as an organization, you recover the cost, but not much more than that. Having said that, there's a few components that you allow these organizations also to make a small profit. So that's why it's called limited profit, this sector, because these organizations are actually supposed to have a few components in the rent calculations that are beyond the cost that is actually that they encounter. And that profit, that surplus, has to be reinvested. So it's not paid out to shareholders. It is equity that is built up over a long period of time, and that capital needs to be reinvested again into new affordable housing. So that's the difference also to the speculative housing market, that you allow profits, but these profits have to be channeled back into productive investments, into affordable housing. And that has also allowed to that this sector has become more independent. They use public subsidies, but even if there's times when public subsidies might not be available, or the conditions are not very different to the sort of conditions you would get on the bank from a bank in a period of the low interest rates. So the idea is really that you have organizations that can invest their own equity and become independent and have a strong equity situation, that they can also financially more viable in the long term, because what you see often, that organizations are required to, like by governments, to charge rents that are not, where they're not able to actually recover the costs, and then these organizations encounter a lot of difficulties. So with this cost rent system, you plus cost rent plus sort of a little limited surplus, you allow organizations to operate also in a financially viable way in the long term. So I think that's a crucial element of this limited profit housing idea.
Zoom in a bit into, I guess, the input, because I think you mentioned that there's a very big constituent in terms of, I guess, how the model actually works. So there's the land aspect, and as well as like the financing aspect, in terms of the financing aspect coming from, I think, bank loans, and as well as, I guess, municipal. So like, let's say talk about the land first. Does Vienna own most of the land? Because I think over in Singapore, so the Singapore government actually owns the bulk of the land on the island. So for Vienna or in Austria in general, does the government actually own the bulk of the land, which allows them to then sell the land cheaply to the association?
The city council has an agency that buys up land strategically, and then they have what's called a developer competition. So they invite all different types of organizations, even for property developers, can participate. So it's an open competition where everyone can participate. And when organizations are then, sometimes it's more if it's a bigger piece of land, when there's more organizations, could be a combination of limited profit and for-profit developers, then they develop and they develop under the conditions that are set by the city council. So the city council then provides the land at affordable rates, and they also say what the conditions are in terms of the social sustainability of a project, the ecological standards. So in a way, the city council sets the standard and invites everyone to participate in a competition. It's a competition-based element in that system, and then when you win this competition, you can then build housing on a piece of land that still allows you to charge rents that are within a range that are affordable. So that's the land is really important, because also in Vienna you had a speculative housing boom, and land prices made it very hard on the private land market for housing associations to buy land. So that's an important element, to have access to affordable land. And the other component are construction costs, which are, again, they're similar for all types of providers. Construction costs have also gone up significantly post-COVID. There was a period of a rapid increase in construction costs within a few years, and that made it also very difficult for our members to build affordable housing. And that is a challenge but usually our organizations, the limited profit housing associations, are also in a position to negotiate with companies conditions that allow them to build at affordable rates. But it obviously depends on the construction markets, the building activity. At the moment, we see a bit of a decline in building activity, and at the same time, we see that the construction costs are becoming a bit more affordable again for housing associations.
That's really good to hear. The limited profit sector actually has to compete with the for-profit sector for some of these lands that are tendered out. Is that the situation?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, how do they actually compete? If let's say you're the city government, right, and you're deciding between a limited profit and a for-profit, which are submitting similar proposals, but I guess limited profit has a higher rate of return, which means that they can then pay more for the land.
The land price is, first of all, the competition is not just on the price. So you have, I mentioned, there's different elements. So the city council is not interested in the highest bidder who can pay the highest money, the highest amount for the piece of land. But they are interested in having the best quality, the best ecological standard, the best architecture, and then they decide the price of land. So they, in a way, have a competition where they set the rules, and they are not interested in selling off the land to the maximum price, but at the best sort of quality that you create. Especially in Vienna, you have some areas now that are being developed in the sort of outskirts of Vienna, or the sort of there's some more centrally located areas, and one very big one, which is already connected to the underground. But you have basically big pieces of land where you develop not just individual building sites, but actually whole neighborhoods. And the idea is really that you build neighborhoods that are socially mixed, that are ecologically sustainable, and you do that by doing these developer competitions, so that you create also the long-term neighborhoods that where lots of different people can actually live, and that are for a city, for the neighbor, for the tenants, for the owners of a neighborhood, actually pleasant places and viable places to live in, financially, ecologically, that you have infrastructure, that you have public transport, that you have schools, that you have hospitals, etc. So the idea is really to create neighborhoods with mixed use, mixed tenure, with lots of different income groups, and not have buildings or neighborhoods where only a certain type of people can live, or only those who can actually, from the highest incomes, that have access to those neighborhoods.
No, that's really important. The social mixing element. So that's really interesting, because the city council actually doesn't just, because I think in Singapore itself, let's say for private developments, is I think of course there's price and quality, but I think the price has a very big factor in terms of whether someone will be able to win the land or not. So it's really interesting to hear about the fact that price is actually not even one of the main consideration for the city council when they're allocating, I guess, the land. And I think just to understand a bit more, I think on the financing side, so for the limited sector, actually there's a whole range of financing options, right? From what I understand is that you can take some bank loans, there's some housing equity from the homeowners, and there's I guess from the city government, there's also some subsidies. How does that all work?
So you have roughly 4 different sources of financing for a housing association. So you have the public loans, like when you build something new in Vienna, typically that accounts for, I would say, 40% roughly of all the financing costs, the construction costs, the land costs. So you have 40% of that is provided by a loan from the city council, is repaid over a long period, over 40 years. But that's provided at a fixed term interest rate, like at the moment, 0.5%, somewhere in that region.
Wow.
And then you have bank loans. Bank loans are dependent on the market condition. We had a period like 2-3 years ago where bank loans were also at the rate of 1.5-2% maybe, very low interest rates, which was also an explicit policy from the European Central Bank, which also aggravated in a way some of the housing problems. But at the same time, it made financing also for our members cheaper. A lot of the housing associations also used a higher share from bank financing. So this accounts again for about, I would say, 40 to 50% of a project. And then you have the equity of the organization. So it's the equity, the surpluses that have been generated by, I can explain where this sort of surplus element comes from, but this equity is then invested also in new developments, especially to buy land. So the equity is mainly used for actually buying the land. And then you have a down payment from tenants at the beginning when they move in. They get that money back when they move out. So this is really and this is usually maybe accounts for 5 to maximum 10% of a new development. So with those 4 sort of financing sources, you then calculate really on a building block level the rent, and you weigh it by the square meter. So it's quite straightforward in terms of having when you live in a 100 square meter apartment, your rent is probably going to be double roughly of a 50 square meter apartment. So it's quite straightforward in terms of how things are calculated. Yeah, so that's pretty much the way housing association finance it. And then you have within this refinancing period, you also have this maintenance element that has to be factored in, etc. So this is the part that is only used this is the financing sources, and then you have additionally obviously other elements in the cost rent calculation. As I mentioned before, this maintenance and improvement. There are service charges, there is administration costs, because also the staff of housing association obviously needs to be paid.
Yes.
And the service charges are used for all the communal elements within the building. So you have usually typically a lift in the building. You have communal rooms. There's a lot of emphasis, especially in Vienna, on communal facilities. So you would have, for example, rooms that you can book as a tenant to make parties, for example. You have that, like if your flat is not big enough, then you can invite more people and you can book that common, like a communal room for the purpose, or other types of communal sort of elements that you would have in the building. So that is usually covered by the service charges, and these service charges also include some taxes, for example, for rubbish collection, etc. So there's also other elements included in the service charges that you would have to typically pay, which have nothing really to do with the actual rent in terms of the financing conditions. So all that in total is the rent that you pay, and that typically covers all the costs that are necessary to run that building effectively, also in the long term, that you have enough revenue as an organization to recover all the costs.
I'm very curious then, like maybe if you can give an example, if there's anything at the top of your head, like if let's say you're average person living in Vienna, how much are you roughly paying for let's say a house? And in terms of this extra rates, like how much are you roughly paying?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it makes sense to tell you euros now, but maybe in terms of a share of your income, like I've just done some calculations where you see that about households spend on average about 25% of their household income on housing costs, but including energy already. So that is obviously a lot higher for lower income households or for people at risk of poverty. Those shares are higher, but on average, that's roughly what you're talking about. So in our sector, the rents are about a quarter cheaper than in the for-profit sector in the total housing stock. So when you look at those 700,000 limited profit rental housing flats in Austria, they are rented out at a price which is about 25% below the for-profit sector. If you look at the new construction, like all the houses that have been built in the last 10 years, then the difference is even bigger, because the pressure, I mentioned that already, in the housing market is bigger, and especially in urban areas in a city like Vienna, the difference between the cost rent in the limited profit housing sector and the more sort of for-profit rents are even higher. So we're talking about 50-60% difference between the cost rents and the limited profit and the for-profit rents.
I
So
see.
depending on the situation in the housing market, I mean, what you also hear, and we've done some studies on that, is the economic impact. So when you have a cost trend, it tells you roughly the cost of housing in a particular moment of time, because the market conditions are relatively similar for all different types of providers. So when you have a cost trend, it tells you in a way that this is the cost of housing in a particular moment in time. And if you have a new development by a speculative housing developer built at the same time under similar market conditions, and they charge a lot more than the cost rent, then you can do the calculations, and you can see that there's probably a lot higher, that the market pressure is probably higher, that they are able to charge higher rents, whereas in the cost-based rental system, you're only paying the actual cost, and you're not, even if the neighborhood becomes more attractive, if the cost in terms of the refinancing doesn't go up, also your rent wouldn't go up. So that also enables that over time, if neighborhoods change, etc., this doesn't mean that people are forced out of housing, as in many other cities where you have neighborhoods becoming more expensive suddenly, so you don't have this phenomenon in the cost rent sector. So it's also important for the social cohesion within the city, within neighborhoods, that you have people living in this type of housing. And also what is different to the private rental housing market is that you have unlimited rental contracts. So when you move into limited profit housing flats, then you are usually you get an unlimited contract. So as long as you pay your rent, you can stay there as long as you want. You have also quite strong tenancy protection, but that is generally the case in Austria, that tenancy law is quite good from a tenant's perspective. So yeah, that's an important element. The difference between the sort of temporary contracts, usually for 3 years in the private rented housing stock, and the unlimited rental contracts that you would get from a limited profit housing association.
I see. No, this is really interesting. So in this case, is the rent then set by the city council / the limited profit association? If let's say like I'm a family that wants to potentially move to another neighborhood, like how does it actually work? So saying is that there is some amount of neighborhood rejuvenation that's happening in different neighborhoods. So does the rent fluctuate based on that as well?
Rent differs only, like if you're talking about the limited profit housing sector, only differs like marginally. It does differ, like depending on, if you move into a new limited profit housing apartment, is probably a bit more expensive than the ones that have been paid off, where all the loans have been paid back. Because I mentioned before, when you have paid back all the loans, then the rent actually goes down. So in a building that is 50-40 years of age, then you have the rent typically actually going down because the loans have been paid back. So you're essentially paying management, etc., plus a limited surplus that is actually calculated in that older housing stock. But from a tenant's perspective, the older housing stock is cheaper. So if you move within the limited profit housing sector, you can have variations in your rents, but they wouldn't be as big as you would have them in the private rented housing stock. So if you move from an older limited profit housing apartment to a newer one, the rent per square meter might be higher, but also the quality might be better. So especially in the last a couple of decades, when you look at this housing that has been built in Vienna, these developer competitions that I've mentioned already, have ensured that there's a lot of emphasis not just on the building quality, but also on the neighborhood quality. So
yes,
it could also mean with a slightly higher rent, we're talking here maybe about 5-10%, then also the qualities of the building and also the quality of the neighborhood might be better, even though there's also a lot of emphasis on managing the existing housing stock. But obviously some of the neighborhood elements, the communal elements are difficult to adapt retrospectively. So the older housing stock, obviously, and that applies to any sector, looks different to what's being built at the moment.
Let's say we're talking about for instance, multi-generational households, right? Let's say the parents live in a house. Do they have a path to buy over the house so that they can ensure that the kids can also, I guess, take over their rental house? Like how does it work? Is there a path to ownership?
In limited profit housing, there is an option to buy under certain conditions, which was introduced in the year 2000. I mean, there is also historically housing that is still managed by housing associations, but in individual ownership of individuals. So you have the option to buy under certain conditions. I'm not going to go into all the details under which conditions, but some people use this option to buy, not all of them. I mean, also you have to consider that when you sell housing at some point, I mean, I think that probably the difference between owning and renting generally in that type of housing is not as big as you would have it in other countries. So I've mentioned the unlimited rental contracts. I've mentioned the relative good affordability. When you're a tenant, a lot of the issues that you might encounter in terms of repairs are actually done by a housing association if you're a tenant. So there's a lot of people, probably for a good reason, staying in the rental markets and not exercising this option to buy. But there is a possibility, and then you could have buildings that are mixed tenure, so you'd have individual owners and tenants in the same building. All of it is still managed by a housing association because you need legally, you need a body who manages the whole building in terms of all the cleaning, the maintenance that concerns the building and not just your individual flat. So even as an owner, you're still paying service charges because you need to pay also for example, potential renovations that might happen at some point. So you need to factor in also these costs in terms of ownership. But there is, as I mentioned, there's an option to buy, which exists in Vienna, but also outside Vienna.
What led to the need to have a path to ownership when the system is so robust in terms of serving individual needs as it currently is? Like, is this certain circumstances whereby people actually want to own the house?
I think in Austria you have a mix of tenures. So I mean, it's legitimate to have a rental market. It's legitimate to have a home ownership market. It's up to people and what they can afford. So it is also sometimes a political decision what you want to prioritize. If you want these organizations to sell their housing, or if you prefer to do policies that focus on rental housing. So there's also in this national piece of legislation that I've mentioned, there's a Limited Profit Housing Act that regulates the whole sector. This has been amended several times throughout its history, and different governments introduce different policies. It's like in the 2000s, there was an emphasis on promoting home ownership in terms of individual home ownership, and that's the result. But having said that, in the past, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there has been housing developed within the sector that has been sold directly. So at the moment, you would have to live in a property for 5 years, and then you can exercise your right to buy. Previously, like decades ago, houses were often sold directly without having to have lived there for a certain period of time. So at the moment, previously it was 10 years, you would have to live in the same place. At the moment, it's 5 years, and then you can ask your housing association for the price, and then you can either accept that price or reject it and not buy it. So yeah, that's the situation at the moment.
When I was doing research as well, I came across the statistic whereby 80% of the Vienna's population is actually eligible for social housing. But in terms of the numbers itself, actually only 40% of the total stock of housing is actually owned by the social sector. I'm just curious, like it is actually a deliberate policy to make it very eligible to a very wide range of the population, right? This is the current kind of situation whereby the Viennese city council and the government is trying to build more to be able to cater to the 80%. Is there ever a target?
I mean, it doesn't mean that like if you have eligibility set at about 70th, 80th percentile, doesn't mean that all of these people are going to apply for a house in the limited profit housing sector. But it is an explicit policy target to have a social mix, social income, different income groups in the type of housing. Because historically, you can see that the support, the attitudes to that sector are a lot better across society when you have different types of people living in there. So it has benefits in many ways, and that's I think also showing in terms of the outcomes in Vienna. You don't have neighborhoods or you don't have that sort of stigma attached to what you have in other countries. Like when you talk about social housing, there's a lot of resistance because it's considered to be poor quality housing for poor people, and that's definitely not the case in Austria. So you have good quality housing competing with the for-profit developers at affordable conditions, and covering lots of different income groups. So I think it's an explicit policy target, and there are specific schemes then targeting within, like when you have a new development or in terms of relets, you would have priority groups, for example, single-family households, single-person households, or, for example, housing like vulnerable households in some categories. So you would have a priority list that you might have priority, but given the size of the housing stock, there is also room that you have always a good social mix. And the idea is really not to have one type of households in a particular housing in a building or in a neighborhood, so that you have a good mix within the building and within the neighborhood.
Because I think that you mentioned earlier in the conversation that I think construction prices, as well as like I guess the interest rate and all this, have all increased since COVID. I'm wondering, how has it actually affected the Vienna/Austria housing market currently?
Yeah, well, the increase, it was a combination of like first construction costs increased quite significantly after COVID, and then from 2022 also interest rates went up quite significantly. Like we're talking about an increase from, on average, let's say from the banks, from 1.5% to 4%, a bit more than 4%, which can have quite a significant impact on the cost rent calculation, because if you have a high share of bank loans and the interest rate goes up, it could impact on the current housing stock in terms of if you have a variable rate, which means it could also impact on the cost rent, because you have to pass on all the costs, even the interest costs, to tenants. But where the impact has even been more was on the new construction, because financing new developments became more expensive in combination with that increase in construction costs. That has meant that housing associations usually have to build under a certain, like they have a limit on the construction cost that they allow to charge, or the rent, like if they build with a subsidy, for example, in Vienna, with a loan, the loan conditions say that your net rent can only be, I think it's at the moment about 6 to 7 euros. And if you don't achieve that with the current sort of market conditions, then you can either build without that subsidy or you don't build at all. And we have seen that there has been, what we're still seeing today, because what the current sort of housing completions of 2025 are in a way a result of the conditions, the construction and the financing conditions that you saw in 2022, 2023, because of the time it takes to develop something, to build it. There's obviously always a time lag. So we can see now the impacts of this period today. Probably this year is going to be the year with the lowest sort of construction that we've seen in a few decades. Probably about 11 to 12,000 homes being completed in our sector, compared to 15 to 16,000 on average in previous years. So it is a significant drop, but it's not a standstill. Like in other countries, you could see that that change of market conditions has really led to a complete standstill of the sector.
Yeah,
it shows you that there is obviously the impact of these market forces on our sector, but it also shows you that there's some resilience in terms of having different financing sources. You can increase, like the city council in Vienna, then increase the share of the public loans, they reduce the interest rate. So there's there was a policy response, but then organizations can also use their internal sources, equity, so they can shift things a little bit and try to make it work again, instead of stopping construction entirely. So that there is a bit of room for maneuver within these organizations. But obviously the conditions in the housing market have impacted. But you can see also that the impact on the for-profit sector, this decline in new construction, has been a lot more in that sector, which is a lot more market-driven, also because of the expectations in house prices not going up or decreasing for a short period of time, has impacted on the for-profit sector a lot more. You can see this boom and bust cycles a lot more in the speculative housing markets than you can see it in that limited profits housing sector, where there's a lot of stability. When you look at the housing output over the last decades, There is variation, obviously, depending on the housing demand, the housing needs, the market conditions, but the variation is a lot more balanced than you would have it in the other type of housing market.
How many, I guess, housing units do actually the for-profit sector produce per year? Because I think that when you say that for the limited profit from about 15 to 20K dropping to 10K, that's quite a substantial decrease.
Well, I think typically the market share is about 50% in that sort of multifamily apartment block buildings. The share of limited profit housing was higher when we look back 20 years. There was probably 60 to 70% of all these houses have been built by limited profit housing associations. Like if you leave out all the single family homes, which are a very different type of the housing market. And at the moment, we're at about 40%. So the increase in the share of limited profit housing in this sector of multifamily housing, bigger sort of apartment housing, has gone up again in the last 1 or 2 years because of that bigger sort of decrease in the for-profit sector. So at the moment it's about 40% is being built by limited profit housing associations, where it was probably more like 30% in previous years in this period of the speculative housing boom.
Wow.
That has meant very high production in the speculative housing market, a relatively stable production in the limited profit housing sector, but it decreased the market share of limited profit housing. And at the moment, because of that market dynamics, you can see the share of limited profit housing going up again, despite both sectors sort of going down a little bit.
I see. Wow.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But that's really good, because it really shows that the market mechanism is really working in terms of shielding the limited sector profit from the I guess the fluctuations in terms of interest rates and the housing boom and bust. I'm very curious as well, what are the current innovations that are happening in, I guess, the Vienna social housing sector? Has there been any new milestones that might be interesting?
I mean, the one element that is still a very important cornerstone is those developer competitions. And in those developer competitions, so we're talking about the new housing, like new construction, you have a lot of innovative techniques in terms of ecological standards, in terms of heating systems, also in terms of social sustainability elements, in terms of the social infrastructure that is provided in neighborhoods. In the existing housing stock, there's a lot of emphasis on decarbonization, meaning that you're switching from fossil-based heating systems to renewable sources or to district heating. So in the limited profit housing sector, about a third of all housing is still using fossil-based heating, like mainly gas, to heat homes. It's a lot higher the share in the other sectors, especially in the old private rented housing stock. Those houses are often still connected to gas heating. In limited profit housing, a high share is already connected to district heating or has heat pumps, but that's a big challenge at the moment to achieve climate goals, that you change the heating system. And there can be quite a challenge, not just the technological aspect, but also if like in terms of the rental law, because you need the permission of every individual tenant. For example, if you wanted to change, like have a different heating system, where if people still had a boiler in their apartment, and you wanted to exchange that to a centralized heating system, either heat pump or even district heating, you would have to get the permission of all the tenants. And so sometimes it's even a legal challenge, because you cannot force people to change the heating system. So you have to convince people. There has to be a communication process that everyone is on board, and then you can do that. And in many cases for that type of work, there are additional subsidies, grant funding available either from the national government or from the city council in the case of Vienna, so that you can achieve those goals. But things are moving, but they're probably not moving as fast as they should be. But the housing sector in general has contributed a lot already to moving towards a non-fossil based sort of future and heating system. So a lot of things have happened, but there's still a lot to do.
I see. And I guess this is also the perfect segue into, I guess, the next question, which is like, what are the biggest criticisms of Vienna's model?
In terms of the total housing market, I mean, one of the biggest challenges in Vienna is still the question of land. I mean, I told you about this body that buys up land strategically, like a public land bank. But the question of land remains a very difficult one, especially for limited profit housing associations. They have some reserves, they have some access to that developer competitions and the land that is being issued and released through these competitions. but it is Vienna is a very compact city, so in inner sort of city areas, there's not much space to build anything new. So it's probably about the new challenge is going to be how to transform the existing housing stock, and also to find land in those areas that are still available, and that is definitely a challenge. And in terms of the financing, those fluctuations in the interest rates have been a challenge. I mean, hopefully now we're moving towards an environment where things become a bit more stable again. We can see a decrease again in interest rates on the banking side. In the limited profit housing sector, the whole question of dealing with the existing housing stock, decarbonizing it, and also having the financial resources to do that. Within that, financing it from the rental stream, I told you that there is this maintenance and an improvement component in the rent, but that is sometimes not enough, especially if you're talking about a faster transition, because this income that you generate from those rental payments is probably enough for normal repairs and for normal sort of renovation cycles. But if you're talking about decarbonizing the housing stock in a much more rapid way, those means probably are often not sufficient to fund the speed of the transition that would be necessary. So there is also some additional public funding necessary to increase the speed of this transformation. And that's definitely one of the biggest challenges within our sector.
Do they plan to tear down some of the old housing and build newer ones? Like, as in, like, what, or is it like they plan to build further out in I guess, city outskirts?
You don't see a lot of demolition where the land became available for new construction. Is actually on old railway yards. So you had a change in the way sort of railways and railway stations were organized in Vienna. So you now have a central railway station instead of having railway stations for every direction that you go. And that made a lot of that land available. And in those areas that are actually quite centrally located, you have new development. There is not a lot of demolition. I mean, you have some reconstruction where you demolish all the building sites and build something new. But also what's quite interesting, having lived in the UK in London, where a lot of the buildings from the 70s, housing estates from the 70s that have been often built to a relatively poor quality have to be demolished now. There are some famous examples in Vienna where these housing estates, because of the good building quality and the good sort of social infrastructure that was built around it, are still in a very good shape, and they don't have to be demolished. They are actually in high demand because they are very affordable, and you don't have this phenomenon that many other cities are facing, where they are now demolishing housing that is maybe 50, 60 years old, housing estates that were built with cheap building materials. You don't really see this phenomenon happening in Vienna because of the better quality that was already used at that time, probably.
That's really, really important, because I think over in Singapore, a lot of the houses are built with reinforced concrete. So the rebar inside actually corrode and rust. So apparently you can't really certify it past, I think, 100 years or something, especially because of how humid Singapore is. I think we transition towards like the last question as we move towards like the closing. What's the biggest misconception like I think outsiders have about Vienna's housing system?
I think it's often idealized or mythicized as something that is only happening because the government provides a lot of funding, and that's actually not the case. The public expenditure in Vienna and the rest of Austria on building housing is actually relatively low. I told you, a lot of it is loan finance, and I think there's this misconception that this is only a system that works because the public sector invests a lot of money. I think this, especially in the limited profit housing sector, you need obviously the right infrastructure, the right framework, the right legislation. If you look at the comparison of public expenditure in Austria, in Vienna, and other cities, they often have to spend a lot more money on housing allowances. I've just recently read a piece of in a German newspaper where a lot of the privatized housing stock that is badly managed, tenants have to claim housing benefits because of the rents that are very expensive. So the state at the end pays a lot more than the public would pay if they had kept them under sort of a regime where you have rents that are affordable and where the homes are properly maintained. So it's I think that's probably one of the misconceptions that exist maybe about Vienna.
No, for sure.
Because the share of people receiving housing allowances is relatively low because of that long-term provision of cost-based housing where you don't need a high proportion of households actually receiving housing allowances. You invest into the construction of buildings, into the renovation. You make sure that the buildings are affordable and available in a good quality in the long term, and then you save a lot of money on basically subsidizing expensive rents. So I think that's also something that I think needs to be understood also on an international level, that affordable housing doesn't have to mean expensive housing in terms of public expenditure, because when you have a housing market where you rely a lot on private landlords charging high rents, and you have to subsidize those high rents, this is often a lot more expensive than actually building good quality housing at a cost-based housing where organizations are recovering their costs. They're even making a surplus, but they are not interested in extracting the maximum amount. I think that's also from the sort of public side, it's something that needs to be understood.
That's really something that's very important. And maybe just one last question, which is like, I think you mentioned there's a very small percentage of people who get housing subsidy. Like, is it like 10%, like 5%? Like, how small of a population is
I think in the total of Austria, it's maybe 5%, but that includes the total population.
Mm-hmm.
Among tenants, I would actually have to check, don't think anything wrong, but I would say it's maybe about 10% of all rental households. And also the intensity of housing allowances is not very high. If you live in a limited profit housing association flat and you have affordability problems and you apply for housing allowance, then as a city council, you're not subsidizing a super expensive rent, but you're supporting someone in a rent where you have cost-based housing, where you only need to pay maybe a smaller amount to actually support that rent, instead of having a very expensive rent and then having to support basically that type of situation. So I think that's, even within those households who receive housing allowances, the intensity of housing allowances is probably lower than you would have in many other countries.
That's a very, very important point. And I think with that, thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Gerald. Listening to Gerald, I'm surprised by how different Vienna's path has been from Singapore's. Both cities solved the impossible, mass affordable housing, but the philosophies couldn't be more different. Before we close, I want to share 4 reflections on what Singapore can learn from Vienna and the trade-offs each model brings. First, wealth versus stability. Vienna secures affordability by decommodifying housing. Much of the stock is permanent rental, run by limited profit associations, financed through long-term loans at about 1% for 40 years. On top of that, there's a permanent funding stream of about $440 million a year, about half from a payroll tax split between workers and employers, and the other half from the rental income and repayment of the existing housing stock. The trade-off is clear. The state shoulders duration risk for providing such a long duration loan, and individuals can pay rent for decades without ever building equity. Security comes at the expense of wealth building. Singapore chose a different path: ownership. Once CPF was linked to housing in 1968, flats had to appreciate at least with inflation to support retirement. A 25 to 30-year loan at 2.5% interest gives household a 99-year asset with equity, heavily subsidized upfront. That frees the state from holding stock permanently, freeing capital for other uses like healthcare or transport. But once flats enter the resale market, they behave like private assets. Prices rise, sometimes far beyond what new grants can offset. The result is a hybrid: public subsidy at start, private accumulation after, and the two can diverge uncomfortably. Second, security without ownership. Vienna shows that secure tenancies can rival ownership. 76% of residents live in rental housing, and these aren't precarious leases. They have no expiration dates and are socially accepted. In fact, holding a permanent tenancy there can sometimes feel even more secure than owning a leasehold flat in Singapore, where mortgage debt, resale volatility, and lease decay all weigh heavily. Our model ties security to ownership, but Vienna proves you can root it in tenure and affordability instead. Third, diversity through competition. Vienna prevents the cookie-cutter monotony we often associate with mass housing by structuring competitions. Any project over 500 units must go through developer competition, judged not just on cost, but also on design, ecology, and community benefit. Singapore tried something similar with DBSS, letting private developers build premium HDB flats. But without caps on profits or rules to reinvest surpluses, developers chase margins and buyers end up balking at prices, and eventually the scheme was suspended. In Vienna, the model works because incentives are structurally aligned. Profits are limited and must be recycled into more housing. Furthermore, they provide tremendously cheap loans to the developers. It's structural, not a one-off scheme. Fourth, planning horizons. Vienna treats housing as permanent civic infrastructure. The city still has around 32,000 apartment blocks built before 1990, about 20% of its entire housing stock, housing nearly 500,000 people. These buildings have been modernized and remain in use even till today. But Singapore doesn't build that way. Our reinforced concrete are designed in a way which rarely lasts beyond 100 years before the rebars corrode because of our humid climate. Could we design for longer lifespans? Technically, yes, with better materials and redundancies. But politically and economically, renewal has always been the chosen path. It gives planners flexibility to recycle land and remake towns through schemes like CERS and in the future, VERS. If you want to dive deeper into the evolution of Singapore's public housing and the dilemmas it now faces, I have linked to the video. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe and see you in the next one.